Toto makes a shocking admission after the Verstappen deal. Red Bull sends a warning to the FIA after an unfair mistake in the race, and McLaren makes a huge statement after winning. Let's get into the latest F1 news. Max Verstappen just crashed out of his home race at Zandvoort, in front of his own fans, the Orange Army. And the man who had the most to say about it was Nico Rosberg, a former world champion who knows better than almost anyone what it feels like when a season starts to unravel at the worst possible moment. But here is what almost nobody is actually talking about. This crash at the Dutch Grand Prix was not just a racing incident. It was a signal. A signal that something deeper is going wrong for the most dominant driver of his generation. And the way Rosberg broke it down tells us something absolutely fascinating about the psychology, the pressure, and the raw mechanical chaos that is Formula One in 2026. Most people watched the highlights, saw Max in the wall, shook their heads, and moved on. But if you actually sit with what happened at Zandvoort, if you trace the sequence of events, the tyre situation, the track conditions, the decision-making in the moment, and then you lay on top of that Nico Rosberg specific analysis of where things went wrong, you get a picture that is both alarming and entirely logical at the same time. Because the scariest thing about this crash is not that it happened. The scariest thing is that you can see exactly why it happened, and that reason has implications for the rest of Verstappen's season. We are going to walk through all of it today. First, we are going to break down exactly what happened at the Dutch Grand Prix and why Zandvoort is one of the most brutally unforgiving circuits on the entire calendar. Then we are going to go deep into Nico Rosberg's specific take on the crash, because Rosberg does not just say what happened, he explains the invisible chain of cause and effect that leads a four-time world champion into the barrier at his home race. After that, we are going to zoom out and ask the bigger question. What does this mean for Verstappen going forward? Because the championship picture right now is not what it was 12 months ago, and incidents like this one have a way of changing everything. Stay with me, because this builds into something you genuinely did not expect by the end. Let us start with Zandvoort itself, because you cannot understand the crash without understanding the track. Zandvoort is one of those circuits that looks almost friendly on a map. It is compact, it winds through the sand dunes on the Dutch coast, and the grandstands are packed so tightly around the circuit that the atmosphere is almost suffocating in the best possible way. But do not let that compact layout fool you. This is a track that punishes the smallest errors with an absoluteness that very few other venues can match. The banking on the final corner is extreme. The walls are close. There is almost nowhere to go when something starts to go wrong, and the surface itself can be deeply unpredictable when temperatures shift or when debris finds its way onto the racing line. Here is the thing that most casual fans miss when they watch a crash like Verstappen's. The moment you see a driver lose control and hit the wall, you are watching the very end of a story that actually started several corners earlier, sometimes several laps earlier. Racing incidents of this kind almost never come out of nowhere. There is always a chain. A small loss of grip here, a fraction of understeer there, a micro-decision made under the kind of pressure that compresses your decision window down to almost nothing, and then suddenly the wall is right there and there is nothing left to do. Zandvoort accelerates all of those chains because the margins are so small and the consequences of going even slightly outside those margins are so immediate. What happened with Verstappen in that race was a convergence of factors, and this is precisely where Rosberg's analysis becomes so valuable. Because Nico is not just giving you the television commentary version of events. He is giving you the engineering and driver psychology version, which is a completely different conversation. Rosberg's angle on the crash centers on something that experienced Formula One observers will recognize immediately but that most fans tend to gloss over, and that is the role of tire management under pressure at a circuit like Zandvoort. When your tires are not in the exact right operating window, when they are either too cold, too hot, or degrading in an uneven way across the four corners of the car, the feedback you get through the steering wheel and through the seat of your pants starts to lie to you. The car feels one way, but it is actually behaving slightly differently from what your nervous system is telling you. And for a driver at the level of Verstappen, someone whose entire career has been built on pushing the absolute limit of what a car can do on any given lap, that mismatch between feel and reality is genuinely dangerous. Rosberg essentially pointed at the idea that Verstappen may have been operating in a zone where the confidence in the car was not fully matched by what the car could actually deliver in that specific moment, at that specific corner, under those specific conditions. Now think about what that means psychologically. This is a driver racing at his home circuit, with tens of thousands of fans wearing orange, screaming his name, carrying his flags, expecting him to deliver. The emotional weight of that situation is not nothing. It does not cripple world champions, but it does add a layer of unconscious pressure that can, at the margins, influence how aggressively you commit to a corner when the data is telling you to be careful. And here is the micro contrast that Rosberg is implicitly drawing, even if he does not phrase it exactly this way. The common mistake that fans make when analyzing a crash like this is to assume that the driver simply made one bad decision in isolation. One late apex. One miscalculated braking point. One moment of overconfidence. But that is almost never the reality. What actually happens is that a series of entirely reasonable decisions, each one individually defensible, stack on top of each other in a way that creates an outcome nobody intended. The crash is the bill that arrives at the end of a sequence of transactions. And Rosberg, as a former champion who has been in those exact high-pressure moments himself, understands that sequence better than most people sitting in television studios. What makes his analysis so interesting is the empathy underneath it. Nico is not piling on Verstappen. He is not doing the thing where former rivals use each other's bad days as an opportunity to reframe history. He is genuinely trying to understand the mechanism, and that understanding reveals something about where Verstappen is right now as a driver and as a competitor. Which brings us to the bigger picture, and this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable for Red Bull and for Verstappen's title hopes. The 2026 season has not gone the way anyone in the Red Bull garage scripted it. The dominance that Verstappen showed in previous years, that era where he and the team seemed to operate on a different plane from the rest of the field, that era is over. The regulations, the competition, the sheer calibration of the rest of the grid has caught up in ways that are now very visible on race weekends. And when you are operating at a narrower margin of advantage, or in some cases no advantage at all, the psychological cost of incidents like Zandvoort multiplies. Every crashed race is not just lost points. It is a signal to your rivals that the window is open. It is fuel for the narratives that surround every championship battle. It creates pressure in the garage, pressure in the boardroom, pressure in the paddock conversations that then filters back to the driver in ways that are subtle but real. Verstappen has always been exceptional at blocking that kind of noise out. His mental strength is one of the genuine defining characteristics of his career at the top level. But even the most mentally robust competitors have a threshold, and the question that hangs over this moment is whether Zandvoort was an isolated incident or whether it is part of a pattern. Here is what the data tells us, and this is the part that Rosberg's commentary actually points toward indirectly. When a driver of Verstappen's caliber starts to have incidents at circuits that should be familiar territory, at tracks where he has historically been strong, that is a signal worth paying attention to. It does not mean he is falling apart. It does not mean the dynasty is over overnight. But it does mean that the relationship between the driver and the car, and between the driver and the pressure of the championship situation, is under a kind of stress that requires a response. What that response looks like is fascinating to speculate about. Does Red Bull change their setup approach? Do they pull back from the aggressive tyre strategies that have defined their racecraft in recent years? Does Verstappen himself recalibrate the way he approaches corners under degrading conditions? These are not simple questions, and the answers to them will play out across the remaining races of the season in ways we can track if we know what to look for. Rosberg essentially set up the framework for that tracking. By identifying the specific mechanism that led to the Zandvoort crash, not just the what but the why, he gave us a lens through which to watch Verstappen for the rest of the year. Is the car finding its window more reliably? Is the driver adjusting his commitment level at the corners where the feedback has been misleading him? Are the results reflecting a correction or a continuation of the same pattern? And what is deeply compelling about this moment in the season, what makes Zandvoort feel like more than just a single bad weekend, is the timing. A home race crash is not just a sporting setback. It is a narrative event. It is the kind of moment that gets replayed and referenced throughout the rest of the season, in press conferences, in paddock conversations, in the mental replays that drivers do whether they admit it or not. The Dutch Grand Prix crowd expected glory. They got heartbreak. And Verstappen, who feeds enormously on the energy of that crowd, that orange sea of passionate support, had to walk away from that energy with nothing to give back to them. That is not a trivial thing. Rosberg knows it. Anyone who has raced at the top level knows it. And the way Verstappen responds to that specific kind of disappointment, the home crowd disappointment, will tell us a great deal about the champion he is becoming versus the champion he has already been. What is also worth noting is that Rosberg's willingness to be so analytically direct about this is itself significant. There is a version of punditry in Formula One that is deliberately vague, carefully non-committal, protecting relationships and paddock access above all else. Rosberg is not doing that here. He is giving us the real framework, the actual analysis, the uncomfortable truths dressed in technical language but pointed directly at what went wrong and why. That takes a certain kind of confidence and a certain kind of independence that is genuinely rare in the broadcast world around this sport. The Dutch Grand Prix was supposed to be the race where Verstappen reminded everyone that the Orange Army's faith was well placed. Instead, it became one of those moments that gets stitched into the longer story of a season, one of those turning points that you can only fully appreciate when you look back at the whole arc from further down the road. Whether that arc bends toward a recovery, toward Verstappen demonstrating once again that he is the most complete driver of his generation, or whether it bends toward a changing of the guard that has been quietly building for the past year, we genuinely do not know yet. The races that follow Zandvoort will answer that question far more definitively than any amount of analysis can right now. What Nico Rosberg gave us was not just a crash breakdown. He gave us a map. A map of exactly where the pressure points are for Verstappen right now, where the car is vulnerable, where the driver's extraordinary skill is being asked to compensate for margins that used to be much more comfortable, and what needs to change if this season is going to end the way Red Bull and their driver desperately want it to end. The Orange Army will be back. They always are. That crowd, that energy, that absolute devotion to their champion is not something that one painful afternoon takes away. But the question of whether Verstappen gives them the ending they are dreaming of, that is a story still being written, corner by corner, race by race, tire window by tire window. And if you want to understand every chapter of it as it unfolds, you need to watch the next race with the framework Rosberg just handed you, because the details are going to matter more than they ever have. Speaking of frameworks for understanding this season's biggest stories, there is another video sitting right next to this one that you are genuinely going to want to see next. What if I told you that one team radio message just changed everything we thought we knew about Adrian Newey's move to Aston Martin? Because what Fernando Alonso said on that radio, mid-race, has set the entire Formula One world on fire, and nobody is talking about the real reason this matters so much. Today we are going in deep on this story, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you are going to see the Newey to Aston Martin situation in a completely different light. We have got the team radio breakdown, the psychology behind what Alonso actually meant, the Newey factor and what it really signals for Aston Martin's future, and the one detail that almost everyone is glossing over. Stick with me because this story has layers, and we are peeling every single one of them back. Let me set the scene for you first, because context is everything in Formula One. Adrian Newey is not just a car designer. The man is the single most successful technical mind the sport has ever produced. Red Bull's dominance across multiple eras, the iconic McLaren cars of the late 90s and early 2000s, championship after championship built around his genius. When news broke that Newey was leaving Red Bull and heading to Aston Martin, the reaction from the paddock was genuinely unlike anything we had seen in years. People were not just surprised. They were stunned. Some were skeptical. Others were excited in a way that felt almost desperate, like fans of a struggling team suddenly daring to believe again. And then Fernando Alonso opened his mouth on the team radio, and everything got even more interesting. Now, before I tell you exactly what was said and what it means, I need you to understand who Fernando Alonso is in this context, because that matters enormously. Alonso is not a driver who throws compliments around casually. He is not a cheerleader. He is a man who has been in Formula One for over 2 decades, who has driven for Ferrari, Renault, McLaren, and now Aston Martin, who has seen the inside of championship-winning operations and also experienced some of the most painful near misses the sport has ever produced. When Alonso speaks about a car, about a technical direction, about the people around him, you listen, because he has earned the right to judge, and he almost never does so publicly without meaning every single word. So when Alonso gets on team radio and references Newey's arrival and what it means for the car and for the team's trajectory, that is not a PR moment. That is not a driver saying nice things for the cameras. That is a 2-time world champion telling you something real about what he believes is coming. And what he communicated on that radio sent a very specific message to the rest of the grid. Think about this from a competitive standpoint. Every other team principal, every other chief technical officer, every other driver heard that radio and had to sit with what it means. Because Alonso does not invest emotionally in projects he does not believe in. His career choices have sometimes confused people from the outside, but when you trace the logic, every single move he has made has been about chasing a competitive car. He left Renault after back-to-back championships. He went to McLaren when they looked like they were building something special. He joined Ferrari for the same reason. He came back to Formula One with Alpine, and then when Aston Martin came calling with the promise of serious investment and now serious technical firepower, he signed. This man bets on himself and on the machinery around him. The fact that he is publicly, on team radio, expressing confidence in what Newey's presence means tells you that from inside that garage, things feel very different right now. Let me give you the actual breakdown of what was communicated and why the specific wording matters. On the radio, Alonso's comments reflected a driver who is not just going through the motions. The message was layered with real anticipation. He was not simply acknowledging that a famous name had joined the team. He was communicating that he feels the shift happening, that the culture and the technical ambition around him at Aston Martin is at a level he has not experienced in a long time. And for a driver like Alonso, who at this stage of his career is acutely aware of time and opportunity, that kind of statement from the cockpit mid-race is significant in a way that is hard to overstate. Now here is where the psychology gets really fascinating. In Formula One, drivers are extremely careful about what they say on team radio, especially anything that might be replayed and analyzed. They know everything is recorded. They know every word can be and will be dissected. So when a driver chooses to express optimism or confidence in a direction during a race, when emotions are high and the filter drops a little, that is often closer to what they genuinely feel than any polished press conference quote. Alonso's radio message was not a press release. It was a human moment. And those human moments in Formula One tell you more than almost anything else. Here is the layer that most coverage is missing, and I really want you to think about this. Aston Martin has been building towards something for several years now. They have constructed a brand new state-of-the-art factory in Silverstone. They brought in experienced personnel from across the paddock. They secured significant investment. But there has always been a question hanging over the project, which is whether they have the intellectual horsepower at the very top of the technical structure to truly challenge for championships. That question is not fully answered overnight. But the arrival of Adrian Newey does something extremely specific for a team like Aston Martin. It does not just add a designer. It changes the gravitational pull of the organization. Other talented engineers and designers now look at Aston Martin and think, that is where the frontier is. That is where the most interesting technical problems are being solved. That is where I want to work. Talent attracts talent in Formula One just like in any competitive industry, and Newey is the biggest talent magnet in the sport's history. Alonso understands this completely. He has been in environments where that gravitational pull exists, and he has been in environments where it does not. The difference in culture, in pace of development, in the quality of solutions you get back when you push problems toward the engineering team, it is night and day. What his team radio communicated is that he feels that pull strengthening. And that should genuinely excite any Aston Martin fan watching this right now. But let me also play devil's advocate here, because this video would not be honest if I did not acknowledge the counterarguments. Newey's history of success is undeniable. But history and future are not the same thing. He is joining a team at a very different stage of development than when he joined Red Bull. The regulations in Formula One change, the technical framework shift, and no single person, however brilliant, is a guaranteed silver bullet. There are people in the paddock who will quietly point out that Newey's era of peak dominance coincided with specific regulatory environments that suited his particular design philosophy. Whether that philosophy translates seamlessly into the current technical rule set and whatever comes next is a legitimate question. It is not a criticism. It is just the honest complexity of the situation. And then there is the timeline question. Formula One is brutally impatient. Teams, sponsors, drivers, and fans all want results now. Newey joining Aston Martin is a strategic long-game move. The real fruit of his work will not appear immediately. Structural changes to a car's concept, philosophical shifts in how aerodynamic problems are approached, those take time to filter through into actual lap time. So when Alonso expresses excitement about Newey's presence, he is expressing belief in a future that is not guaranteed to arrive within any specific window. At his age, every season is precious. Every race weekend is one he cannot get back. The emotional weight of that reality makes his optimism even more striking, because he has done the math on his own timeline and he still thinks this is worth betting on. Let me take a step back and talk about what this moment represents for Formula One more broadly, because I think it is worth zooming out. For a significant stretch of recent history, the sport has been framed around Red Bull's dominance and then the transition to a new competitive order. Teams like Mercedes and Ferrari have been trying to claw back ground. New regulations have reshuffled some of the hierarchy. And into all of this arrives the possibility that Aston Martin, currently a midfield team with championship aspirations, might actually be building something that could eventually disrupt the established order. That narrative is exactly what Formula One needs. Not just for fans of Aston Martin or fans of Alonso or even fans of Newey, but for the health and drama of the sport itself. Real competition at the front of the grid, genuine uncertainty about who is going to find the performance breakthrough. That is what makes Formula One the most watched motorsport on earth. Alonso's team radio moment, whether it was fully intended as a public statement or not, has become part of that narrative. It is a data point in a larger story about whether Aston Martin can become a genuine championship contender within a realistic timeframe. And right now, after everything that has been announced and communicated, the balance of evidence points more toward yes than it did 18 months ago. Now I want to talk about the competitive dynamics this creates, because this is where it gets really tactical and interesting. Think about how the other top teams are going to respond to the Newey and Alonso combination at Aston Martin. Red Bull, where Newey spent the bulk of his career defining how a modern Formula One car should look and behave, now has to contend with the fact that his institutional knowledge, his way of thinking about design problems, is now sitting in a rival garage. That is uncomfortable for them in a way that goes beyond just losing a designer. It is the knowledge that someone who knows how you think, how you solve problems, how you approach development, is now thinking about how to beat you. For Mercedes and Ferrari, the signal is different but equally significant. It tells them that Aston Martin is serious in a way that cannot be dismissed. You do not recruit Adrian Newey for the optics. You recruit him because you are genuinely trying to build a car that can win a championship. That forces those teams to recalibrate how seriously they take Aston Martin as a future threat, and that recalibration itself changes how they allocate resources and attention. Alonso sitting in that cockpit, on that team radio, expressing what he expressed, is the human embodiment of all this competitive reality. He is the signal to the rest of the paddock that this is real, that the investment is real, that the ambition is real, and that at least one of the fastest and most experienced drivers in the sport's history believes it is real enough to commit his remaining competitive years to it. Let me bring this back to the fan perspective for a moment, because I think that is where the emotional heart of this story lives. If you are an Aston Martin supporter, you have been through a specific journey over the last few years. There was the excitement of the rebrand, the arrival of serious investment, the signing of Alonso himself, which felt almost too good to be true. There were flashes of genuine pace in certain conditions, moments where you could see what the team might become. And there have also been the frustrating races, the mechanical issues, the development rate that has not always been as steep as the initial promise suggested. That combination of hope and frustration is the defining emotional experience of supporting a team that is trying to make the leap from challenger to contender. Newey's arrival and Alonso's response to it on team radio is the latest and perhaps most significant chapter in that journey. It is the moment where the narrative might actually be shifting from potential to progress, from what could be to what is starting to be. And that emotional transition, from hope to belief, is genuinely powerful for anyone who has been following this story. There is one more thing I want to address before we wrap up, and it is the question that some of you are definitely thinking about. Is Alonso still going to be at Aston Martin when the real fruits of Newey's work arrive? That is the raw and honest question underneath all of this. Because if Newey's impact on the car's design philosophy and performance trajectory takes 2 or 3 full seasons to fully materialize, is Alonso still going to be competing at the level required to capitalize on it? He has defied age expectations at every turn in his career. He has shown pace and racecraft that would be remarkable for drivers 10 or 15 years younger. But time does not negotiate. And the intersection of when the car becomes a genuine championship tool and when Alonso is still at his absolute competitive peak is the critical variable in this story. What the team radio message suggests is that Alonso himself is betting that intersection exists, that he has looked at the timeline, talked to the people in the team, understood what Newey is building and how long it will take, and concluded that there is a realistic window where everything comes together while he can still perform at the very highest level. That is either the most inspiring thing you have heard all week or it will eventually become one of the sport's great what ifs. And honestly, both of those possibilities are part of what makes Formula One so compelling. So where does this leave us? We have a 2-time world champion communicating genuine belief in a project from the cockpit in the heat of competition. We have the sport's greatest ever designer now embedded within a team that has invested heavily in infrastructure and talent. We have the rest of the paddock recalibrating their threat assessments. And we have a narrative arc for Aston Martin that is genuinely more compelling than anything the team has had since the project began. The team radio moment that started this entire conversation is small in isolation. A few words transmitted between a driver and his engineers on a race weekend. But in context, surrounded by everything we know about who these people are and what they are trying to build, it is actually a window into something much larger. It is evidence that the Aston Martin project has moved from ambition to belief, at least internally, and that the person driving the car thinks what is coming is worth getting excited about. Whether you are a fan of Alonso, a fan of Aston Martin, a follower of Newey's career arc, or just someone who loves Formula One and wants to see the competitive landscape genuinely shift, this story is one of the most interesting threads running through the sport right now. And it is only going to develop further. If you made it this far, first of all, thank you. You clearly care about this stuff as much as I do. I want to know what you think in the comments. Do you believe Aston Martin can become a genuine championship team within the next 3 years? Do you think Alonso's confidence is justified, or is he projecting optimism onto a situation that still has a lot of uncertainty baked into it? And what does Newey's arrival actually mean for the broader competitive balance of the grid? Drop your thoughts below. This is the kind of conversation that is worth having properly, not just in hot takes but in real analysis. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed, because we go deep on Formula One here in a way that I genuinely believe you will not find anywhere else. And make sure you hit the notification bell, because the next video in this series is going to look at the technical specifics of what Newey might actually change about how Aston Martin builds their car, and that one is going to blow your mind. See you there. Liam Lawson is furious. And honestly, after what happened at the Dutch Grand Prix, can you really blame him? Because what unfolded on track between him and Max Verstappen was one of those moments that splits the entire Formula One community right down the middle. Stewards made a call. Lawson has some very strong feelings about that call. And today we are going to break down every single layer of this situation, because there is a lot more going on here than a simple racing incident. Before we get into it, if you are new here, welcome to the channel where we break down Formula One from every angle, including the controversial ones. Hit that subscribe button, because we have been covering the 2026 season intensely and you do not want to miss a single thing. Now let us set the scene properly, because context is everything in Formula One. The Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort has always been one of the most intense races on the calendar. The circuit is narrow. Overtaking opportunities are limited. And when you mix Max Verstappen defending his home race in front of an absolutely electric crowd of orange-clad fans with a young, hungry driver like Liam Lawson who has absolutely nothing to lose, you are essentially pouring fuel onto a fire that was always going to ignite at some point during that race weekend. Lawson came into this race with serious motivation. The New Zealander has been on a mission throughout the 2026 season to prove that Red Bull made the right call investing in him, and every points finish, every strong qualifying lap, every overtaking move matters enormously to his career trajectory right now. He knows it. The team knows it. And the paddock knows it too. So when the incident happened between Lawson and Verstappen, it was not just a racing incident between two drivers. It carried the weight of a young driver trying to assert himself against arguably the most dominant figure Formula One has seen in the modern era. The dynamics at play here were always going to make whatever happened feel bigger than it actually was, and the FIA decision that followed made it even more explosive. Here is what Lawson had to say about the situation, and I want you to really listen to the substance of his words rather than just the emotion behind them. Lawson essentially questioned whether the outcome was predictable, not just in terms of the physical crash itself, but in terms of how the stewards would respond to it. He raised the point that when you go wheel to wheel with Verstappen, there seems to be a pattern in how these situations get adjudicated. And that word, predictable, is doing a lot of heavy lifting in his statement. When a driver publicly questions the consistency of FIA decision-making, that is not a small thing. Drivers are very carefully managed in terms of what they say publicly. Teams have media training. There are PR people constantly hovering in the background. So when a driver goes on record and uses language that challenges the governing body's process, it means one of two things. Either they genuinely feel so wrong that they cannot contain it, or the team has calculated that going public with the frustration serves some kind of strategic purpose. In Lawson's case, it feels like the former. This felt raw. This felt genuine. And that rawness is actually what makes the entire story so compelling. Now let us talk about Max Verstappen's side of this, because we cannot have a complete picture without understanding what Verstappen represents in these situations. Max has always raced in a very particular way. He is aggressive. He leaves very little room. He forces opponents to make split-second decisions under enormous pressure. And throughout his career, that style has generated countless controversial moments, countless debates, and a remarkable number of incidents where the question of fault becomes genuinely murky. The thing about racing against Verstappen is that experienced drivers know what they are getting into. When you go door to door with Max, you are not racing against someone who is going to suddenly give you 3 car widths of space out of politeness. He will hold his line. He will make you uncomfortable. And if you flinch, he wins. If you do not flinch, sometimes you crash. That is the reality. Lawson, to his enormous credit, chose not to flinch. And the result was contact that ended or significantly damaged his race. So now the question becomes, was that contact Lawson's fault, Verstappen's fault, or just one of those things that happens when 2 drivers refuse to yield? The FIA stewards had to make that call. And based on Lawson's public reaction, they did not make it in his favor. The fact that he used the word predictable suggests he felt that the scales were already tipped before anyone even looked at the evidence. That is an extraordinary accusation to make, even if it is couched in careful language. Let us zoom out for a second and think about the broader patterns here. This is not the first time questions have been raised about how incidents involving Verstappen get handled by stewards. Over the years, his racing style has generated enormous debate. There have been fans, pundits, and even some within the paddock who have suggested that his reputation and his status as a multi-world champion affords him a certain amount of latitude that other drivers simply do not enjoy. Others strongly disagree with that view and argue that he races within the rules and that his opponents need to simply adapt. The truth, as it often is in Formula One, probably lives somewhere in between those two positions. Verstappen is genuinely brilliant at exploiting the boundaries of the regulations. He knows exactly where the line is. He has an almost supernatural ability to be aggressive without technically crossing into outright illegal territory. That makes him incredibly difficult to steward, because you are constantly dealing with situations that are technically within the rules but emotionally feel wrong to the person on the receiving end. Lawson is not the first driver to feel that way, and he will almost certainly not be the last. But what makes his response particularly interesting is his level of directness. Young drivers in Formula One tend to be very diplomatic when it comes to the stewards and the FIA. They understand that upsetting the governing body carries risks. Penalty points, reputational damage, a perception that you are difficult to manage. Lawson throwing caution to the wind and publicly questioning the decision suggests a level of confidence that is actually quite admirable, even if it creates complications. There is also something deeply psychological happening in this moment. Think about what Lawson is dealing with from a career perspective. He arrived at Red Bull Racing with massive expectations and the constant shadow of being in a seat that so many other talented drivers had occupied before him. Every race he has to prove himself worthy. Every incident, especially one involving his team's most decorated driver, carries enormous political weight. Going up against Verstappen on track is one kind of challenge. Going up against the narrative surrounding Verstappen in the court of public opinion and in the steward's room is an entirely different kind of challenge. And the fact that Lawson is choosing to fight on both fronts simultaneously tells you something about his character and his hunger to be taken seriously as a racing driver rather than just as a passenger in the Red Bull system. Now, some people watching this are going to take Verstappen's side entirely. And I understand that perspective completely. Max has earned his status in this sport through relentless hard work, breathtaking natural talent, and a willingness to push every single boundary. His fans, and there are millions of them, will argue that Lawson was the inexperienced driver making an optimistic move and that the outcome was entirely his own responsibility. Those fans are not entirely wrong either. Lawson is still building his Formula One story. He does not yet have the racecraft that comes from hundreds of Grands Prix. Making a move on Verstappen at a circuit like Zandvoort carries massive risk, and experienced paddock observers would have warned him about exactly that before the race weekend even started. But here is the thing that keeps nagging at me, and I think it nags at a lot of honest Formula One observers too. The sport has a responsibility to apply its rules consistently regardless of who is involved. If a specific type of contact warrants a penalty when driver A does it to driver B, then that same type of contact should warrant a penalty when driver C does it to driver D. The identity of the drivers should not influence the severity of the response. When a driver as credible as Lawson publicly suggests that the outcome felt predictable based on who was involved, that is the sport failing at that basic standard of consistency. Whether he is right or wrong about the specifics of this incident is almost secondary to the fact that the perception of inconsistency exists at all. Perception in Formula One matters enormously. Sponsors make decisions based on perception. Fans engage based on perception. Young drivers choose to enter or avoid certain situations based on perception. If the perception takes hold that certain drivers exist in a protected category when it comes to stewarding decisions, that is genuinely bad for the health of the sport. And the FIA knows this. They have been making significant efforts in recent years to improve the consistency and transparency of their stewarding process. They publish documents. They explain reasoning. They have brought in more experienced figures to oversee the process. But clearly, from Lawson's perspective at least, that work has not yet produced the results needed to eliminate these kinds of doubts. Let us now think about what happens next, because this story does not end with Lawson's comments to the media. There are several threads that will play out in the coming weeks, and they are all worth watching closely. First, there is the intra-team dynamic at Red Bull. Lawson and Verstappen are teammates. They have to continue working together, sharing data, sitting in the same debriefs, working toward the same championship goals. The tension that public comments like these create within a team environment is not trivial. Red Bull management will need to navigate this carefully, making sure neither driver feels undermined while also not appearing to take sides publicly. Christian Horner and the leadership team at Red Bull have experience managing complex driver relationships. This is not the first time the team has had to deal with friction between its two cars. But the specific nature of this friction, one driver publicly questioning the fairness of how an incident involving his teammate was handled by the sport's governing body, is a uniquely delicate situation that does not have an easy playbook. Second, there is the question of how the FIA responds. They could choose to say nothing, letting the incident fade from the news cycle. They could issue a clarification about their reasoning process. Or, in the unlikely but not impossible scenario, they could take some kind of formal action against Lawson for his public comments, which would only add fuel to an already burning fire. My expectation is that they say nothing publicly and deal with any concerns through private channels, but the way these things have played out in 2026, you can never be entirely certain. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the long-term narrative of this season, there is the question of how Lawson himself responds on track. Does this incident become a turning point that fires him up and produces some of his best racing performances of the year? Or does the political fallout become a distraction that affects his performance and his relationship with the team? The answer to that question will tell us a great deal about who Liam Lawson really is as a racing driver and as a person. History is full of examples of drivers who turned controversy into motivation. Some of the greatest Formula One performances of all time have come in the aftermath of moments where a driver felt wronged and channeled that emotion into something extraordinary on track. If Lawson has that kind of mental fortitude, and his public statements suggest he does, then the Dutch Grand Prix incident might actually end up being a defining moment in his career for reasons nobody expected. There is also a wider conversation that this incident opens up about the FIA and consistency that goes well beyond just Lawson and Verstappen. Formula One in 2026 is dealing with a sport that is larger, more global, and more closely scrutinized than it has ever been before. The Drive to Survive era brought in millions of new fans who watch every decision with fresh, unfiltered eyes. They do not have decades of institutional memory telling them this is just how Formula One has always worked. They ask questions. They form opinions. They share those opinions loudly on social media. When one of those new fans watches Lawson's post-race comments and then looks at the steward's decision and finds themselves nodding along with his frustration, that is a problem for the sport's credibility. The FIA's challenge in this era is not just making the right call in any given incident. It is making the call in a way that can be clearly explained and understood by a massive audience that is watching with no particular loyalty to institutional tradition. Whether the stewards got this specific decision right or wrong, and there are very legitimate arguments on both sides, the fact that it generated this level of controversy suggests that the communication around it needs to be better. Fans and drivers alike deserve to understand not just what the decision was but why, with enough detail to evaluate whether it was consistent with how similar situations have been handled before. That brings me to something I think about a lot when it comes to Formula One governance. The sport is still running some of its regulatory processes in ways that were designed for a very different media environment. Real-time global scrutiny requires real-time clarity. Stewarding decisions need to be explainable in plain language within minutes of being made, not buried in technical documents that only hardened Formula One insiders can decode. The sport has made progress on this, but there is still a significant gap between where the communication currently is and where it needs to be. Lawson's public challenge is actually doing the sport a favor, even if it creates short-term friction. It forces a conversation about consistency, about process, and about whether the people making these decisions are being held to the same standard of accountability that drivers are held to on track. That is a healthy conversation for Formula One to have, even if it is an uncomfortable one. Now let me tell you what I think is really going to happen here. The Dutch Grand Prix incident will fade from the headlines within a couple of race weekends. Lawson will put in some strong performances, the team will smooth things over internally, and the FIA will carry on doing what they do. The specific controversy will become just another entry in the long list of contentious moments that Formula One generates season after season. But the underlying questions it raises will not go away. The question of whether certain drivers receive more favorable treatment in stewarding situations will continue to simmer. The question of whether Lawson can establish himself as a true equal at Red Bull rather than just a supporting player in Verstappen's championship story will continue to define his season. And the question of whether the FIA has the tools, the will, and the communication skills to earn the trust of a modern, global, digitally engaged Formula One audience will continue to be one of the central challenges the sport faces. This is what makes Formula One so endlessly fascinating. It is never just about the racing. It is always about the politics, the personalities, the power dynamics, and the human stories that play out alongside the on-track action. Liam Lawson questioning the FIA decision is a sporting story on the surface, but underneath it is a story about a young man fighting for respect in one of the most competitive environments on Earth, against one of the most formidable opponents any racing driver could face. I am genuinely excited to watch how this continues to unfold. Lawson has shown real character in how he has handled this publicly. He has been direct without being disrespectful. He has raised legitimate questions without descending into personal attacks. That kind of mature, measured criticism is actually quite rare in Formula One, where drivers tend to either bottle everything up or completely lose their composure. If he can carry that same measured intensity onto the track over the remaining races of the 2026 season, he is going to be an absolutely compelling figure to follow. The best thing that can happen for his career at this point is for him to channel every ounce of frustration from this incident into lap times. Nothing silences critics, and nothing earns respect from difficult teammates, quite like pure speed and racecraft under pressure. And for Verstappen's part, he has been here before. He knows what it feels like to have someone question his racing style, to be on the wrong side of public sentiment. He has always responded by going faster and winning more. Whether that remains the story in 2026, as the competition gets closer and the cars continue to evolve under the new regulations, remains to be seen. That is the beauty of Formula One. Every race adds another chapter to stories that began long before and will continue long after. The Dutch Grand Prix was one chapter. The response from Lawson was another. What comes next is completely unknown, and that uncertainty is exactly what keeps all of us coming back every single race weekend. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a like on the video because it genuinely helps get this content in front of more Formula One fans who care about these kinds of deeper dives. Leave a comment below telling me where you stand on this. Was Lawson right to speak out publicly? Was the FIA decision justified? Is Verstappen simply that much better at working the edges of the rules than everyone else? I want to hear your perspective. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one. Tens of thousands of orange-clad Dutch fans watched their race get stolen, not by a rival driver, not by a blown tyre, but by 3 stewards, a laptop, and 47 minutes of deliberation. Formula One has always been a sport where split-second decisions on track can be completely overturned by stewards sitting in a room with a laptop and a rulebook. And right now, the FIA has done it again. A penalty at the 2026 Dutch Grand Prix has sent the entire F1 community into absolute meltdown, and honestly, when you look at the details, you will completely understand why. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, we cover everything Formula One, from the technical drama to the political chaos that seems to follow this sport everywhere it goes. Make sure you subscribe because this story is still developing and we are going to be covering every single twist as it happens. So let us get into it. Zandvoort, the Dutch Grand Prix 2026. A race that had everything. Strategy battles, wheel-to-wheel racing, moments of genuine brilliance from multiple drivers. And then the stewards got involved. And just like that, the narrative of this race changed completely. Now before I tell you exactly what happened, I want you to understand the broader context here because this penalty does not exist in a vacuum. This is happening in a year where the FIA has been under an almost unprecedented level of scrutiny. The new regulations that came in for 2026 changed Formula One in ways that nobody fully anticipated. The cars are different, The power units are completely different, and the balance of performance between teams shifted dramatically when the season began. That instability on track has created more racing incidents, more steward interventions, and more controversy than we have seen in years. So when a penalty lands at a race as emotionally charged as the Dutch Grand Prix, the reaction is always going to be enormous. Zandvoort is one of those tracks where the crowd becomes almost a 12th team. The Dutch fans who fill that circuit every year are passionate in a way that is hard to describe if you have never experienced it. They show up in orange, they are loud, they are knowledgeable, and they care deeply about what happens on that piece of tarmac. So any controversy at this race is automatically amplified by the emotional investment of tens of thousands of people who are physically present and millions more watching around the world. Now here is what we know about the incident that led to the penalty decision. During the race, there was a moment that the stewards decided warranted investigation. A racing incident, the kind that happens dozens of times across a Formula One season, became the focal point of a steward's inquiry. And the decision that came out of that inquiry is what has divided the paddock, the media, the fans, and frankly everyone who watched that race. The penalty itself changed the race result. That is the thing that makes this story so significant. We are not talking about a time penalty that had no effect on the final standings. We are talking about a decision by officials that physically moved a driver or team up or down the order in a way that affected championship points. In 2026, with a genuinely competitive championship battle happening across multiple teams, every single point matters. Losing points because of a steward decision rather than because of something that happened on track is the kind of thing that drives drivers, team principals, and fans absolutely crazy. Let me take you through the different perspectives here because this is genuinely complex and I think it is important to represent multiple viewpoints fairly. On one side, you have the argument that the rules exist for a reason. Formula One is a sport built on regulations. The technical regulations, the sporting regulations, the rules about how drivers can race each other, these things are not arbitrary. They exist to create a framework within which teams and drivers can compete. If you start ignoring the rulebook every time enforcing it becomes emotionally inconvenient, you undermine the entire competitive structure of the sport. From this perspective, the stewards saw a rule violation, they applied the penalty the regulations call for, and their job was done correctly regardless of how popular or unpopular that decision might be. On the other side, there is a legitimate argument about consistency. And this is where Formula One really struggles. The FIA stewards at each race are different people. Different panels can and do reach different conclusions about identical or near-identical incidents. What gets a penalty at one race might not even get investigated at another race 2 weeks later. Drivers and teams have complained about this inconsistency for years, and honestly, it is one of the most persistent criticisms of Formula One's officiating structure. When drivers say they do not know where the line is, they are not making excuses. They are identifying a genuine systemic problem. Then there is the third perspective, which is the one that tends to generate the most heat on social media. This is the view that the penalty was not just wrong but was the product of poor judgment, poor process, or something even more problematic. Now I am not going to sit here and make accusations I cannot substantiate. But I will say that when decisions affect championship outcomes and those decisions are made quickly by stewards who are not always consistent, questions about the quality of the officiating process are entirely legitimate. One of the things I find fascinating about these steward controversies is what they reveal about the emotional relationship that fans have with Formula One. People are not just upset because a rule was applied. They are upset because they feel that the sport they love is being damaged by decisions made by officials who seem detached from the reality of racing at 300 km per hour. There is a fundamental tension between the bureaucratic need for rules and enforcement and the organic, chaotic, beautiful nature of wheel-to-wheel racing. That tension never fully goes away in any motorsport, but Formula One manages to make it feel more acute than almost anywhere else. Now let us talk about the aftermath because this is where things get really interesting. In the hours and days following the Dutch Grand Prix, the paddock was buzzing. Team principals gave carefully worded statements. Drivers, some more diplomatically than others, made their feelings known. Social media did what social media does, which is take a complex situation and compress it into the most extreme possible version of itself. Within hours of the penalty being announced, people had already decided whether it was the worst call in the history of motorsport or a completely justified application of the regulations, with very little nuance in between. The FIA, for their part, went through their standard process. There is a right of review mechanism in Formula One that allows teams to challenge steward decisions if they can present significant new evidence. This is not the same as an appeal, which was actually abolished years ago for on-event decisions. The right of review is a higher bar. You cannot just say you disagree with the stewards. You have to present information that was not available to them when they made their original decision. Whether the affected team or driver pursues this avenue is something that will play out in the days following the race. What is already clear is that this incident is going to add fuel to a debate that has been smouldering in Formula One for a long time. The debate about whether the stewardship process needs fundamental reform. There have been proposals over the years for various changes. Having a permanent panel of experienced stewards rather than different panels at each race. Using more advanced technology to make objective assessments of incidents. Bringing in former drivers in a more structured and consistent way. All of these ideas have merit and all of them have complications. The driver steward program is actually something the FIA implemented specifically to address the criticism that officials making decisions about racing had never experienced what it feels like to actually race at that level. Having someone in the room who can say, from personal experience, what a driver can and cannot see in a specific type of incident is genuinely valuable. But the program has not eliminated controversy because the fundamental problem is not just about experience or empathy. It is about consistency and the inherent ambiguity in interpreting what are ultimately judgment calls in a sport moving at extraordinary speeds. Here is something I want you to think about. Formula One in 2026 is the most commercially successful it has ever been. The sport's global reach, its presence in North America, its new fan base built through media exposure over the past several years, all of this has created enormous pressure on the FIA and Formula One management to deliver a product that feels fair and exciting. Controversial steward decisions threaten that. They create narratives about the sport being manipulated or poorly run. They give casual fans a reason to disengage. And they give the sport's critics ammunition. At the same time, Formula One cannot and should not abandon its rulebook just because applying the rules creates controversy. The tension here is real and there are no easy answers. What you can do is try to make the process better. More transparency in how decisions are reached. Clearer communication to fans about why a specific rule was applied in a specific situation. More consistency across events. These are achievable goals even if they require significant organizational commitment. Let me bring this back to Zandvoort for a moment because I do not want to lose sight of the specific incident in all this broader discussion. The Dutch Grand Prix is a special race. It always has been. The return of this event to the Formula One calendar a few years back was a moment of genuine excitement for the sport. The circuit is unique, technical, challenging in ways that reward real driving skill. The atmosphere is unlike almost anything else on the calendar. When something goes wrong at Zandvoort, it hurts a little more than it might somewhere else, precisely because of how much goodwill and emotional investment surrounds that event. The drivers and teams who came out on the wrong side of this penalty decision are not just dealing with a sporting setback. They are dealing with the frustration of having their performance at a beloved, high-profile race defined by a post-race decision rather than by what they did on the track. That is genuinely difficult to process, regardless of whether the stewards were technically correct in their application of the regulations. And for the fans who were there at Zandvoort or watching at home, this penalty creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. They watched a race. They formed a narrative about what happened. And then hours after the checkered flag, that narrative was altered. The person or team they thought had achieved something significant either gained or lost depending on which side of the penalty they were on. That discontinuity between the live experience of watching a race and the official result that emerges later is something that Formula One has never fully figured out how to handle gracefully. Okay, so where does this leave us going forward? A few things I think are worth watching. First, the championship implications. If this penalty has shifted points in a significant way, its effects will ripple through the rest of the 2026 season. Every subsequent race result will be viewed partially through the lens of what happened in the Netherlands. Teams will be calculating whether a different outcome here would change their strategic approach in the races that follow. Second, the FIA's response. How the governing body handles the aftermath of this decision will tell us a lot about where Formula One's officiating is heading. If they engage with the criticism constructively, acknowledge any shortcomings in their process, and use this as an opportunity to improve, that is a positive sign. If they retreat into institutional defensiveness and dismiss all criticism as coming from people who simply did not like the outcome, that is a much more troubling indicator. Third, the team and driver reactions. Depending on how vocal the people most affected by this decision choose to be, this story could stay in the news cycle for weeks. Formula One drivers and team principals have different relationships with controversy. Some prefer to address things head-on and keep pushing publicly for what they believe is right. Others prefer to work through official channels and keep the public statements diplomatic. The approach taken here will shape how this particular controversy resolves. Fourth, and this is the one I find most interesting from a long-term perspective, the broader conversation about reform. This incident, like every significant officiating controversy before it, creates a moment where the sport has an opportunity to genuinely examine its processes. Whether that opportunity gets seized or whether this becomes just another controversy that fades from memory as the next race weekend approaches, that is the real question. Formula One has a remarkable capacity to generate controversy and then move on from it. The sport moves so fast, literally and figuratively, that last week's scandal becomes background noise pretty quickly. The Dutch Grand Prix penalty will eventually recede into the long list of steward decisions that defined or failed to define seasons past. But while it is fresh, while people are still emotionally engaged with it, it is worth taking seriously, asking the hard questions, and demanding better from the people who govern this sport. Because here is the thing. The reason this generates so much passion is not because Formula One fans are irrational. It is because they care deeply. The people watching, arguing, analyzing, and debating what happened at Zandvoort this weekend are demonstrating exactly the kind of engagement that makes Formula One special. That passion is an asset to the sport. Treating it with respect, responding to legitimate concerns with genuine transparency, that is how you honor the investment that millions of people make in following this sport week after week. The FIA has a chance here, not just to handle this specific incident well, but to demonstrate that Formula One's governing body is capable of the kind of self-reflection and improvement that a sport this popular and this important deserves. Whether they take that chance is something we will be watching very closely. And so will you, I am guessing, since you made it this far into the video. If you want to stay on top of every development in this story as it unfolds, the subscribe button is right there and the notification bell means you will not miss anything. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand on this. Was the penalty right or wrong? Should the FIA reform its stewardship process? How do you think this affects the rest of the 2026 championship? Let me know below. There is also a video right over there that goes deep on the broader state of Formula One officiating and the history of controversial decisions that have shaped championships. If this topic has got you fired up, that one is going to give you a lot more context and honestly probably make you even more fired up, but in the best possible way. I will see you in the next one.